There's a particular silence you notice when you're this deep underground, thick, still, like even sound has a hard time escaping. I've worked renovations for over 20 years. Modern homes, Victorian estates, even a church once, but nothing ever felt quite like that monastery in the French Alps. The job should have been simple. The client had deep pockets and big plans. Turn abandoned 13th century monastery into a high-end luxury resort. Stone walls, vaulted ceilings, rustic charm. All the bones were there. My job was to clean and rebuild the skeleton, then let the designers dress it up. It wasn't even my first time working in old religious buildings. But this one felt different from the start. The upper floors were still sound enough, if dusty. The refectory would become a restaurant. The old dormitories, suites. But it was the wine cellars that would become the showpiece. A spa and wellness center with an authentic monastic ambience, as the brochure would later boast. I had no idea what we were walking into. We started with the obvious. Clearing out rotted barrels and centuries of dust, reinforcing cracked archways, chasing out mice. Nothing unusual. But then we found a patch of stone in the lowest cellar, off in a narrow alcove beneath what used to be the chapel. It was out of place. The masonry looked different, older, cruder but sturdier. A thick segment of wall, maybe 6 feet wide, embedded with iron bands that weren't rusted like the rest. They glinted, strangely, even in the poor light. The stones had been mortared over and sealed again and again. Whoever had done this didn't want it opened. My foreman thought maybe it was an old storeroom. Maybe wine worth a fortune was locked behind that wall. I didn't care about the wine. I should have cared about the wall. When we brought in the jackhammer, the air shifted. Not in any mystical way. I mean physically. The pressure dropped, like a storm rolling in underground. Dust curled away from the floor in strange patterns, and a faint metallic taste crept into my mouth. Still, we kept going. It took a full day to break through. Underneath the plaster and stone was a set of iron doors, each one barely taller than a man, bolted shut and sealed with thick red wax. Symbols were carved deep into the metal, not in any language we could recognize. Crosses, maybe, or something meant to look like them. One of the newer workers suggested we stop and call a historian. He didn't come back after lunch. I figured he just didn't want to risk the overtime. We pried the doors open the next morning. Beyond them was a tunnel, not very long, just maybe 20 feet, lined with alcoves that once held bodies. Most were empty now, their occupants rotted away or disturbed by centuries of shifting earth. But some were not. Bones lay in heaps, not laid to rest but scattered, tangled, broken. Femurs snapped cleanly. Skulls cracked down the center. Something had happened in there. Something violent. Something final. And then we reached the end. A chamber no bigger than a 2-car garage, carved entirely in stone. A single, massive slab stood at its center, a coffin, if you could call it that. Unlike everything else, it was pristine. Smooth. Cold. The same symbols from the iron doors had been etched into its surface, but deeper here. As though whoever did this wanted to carve through the stone itself. Sealed again with wax, and inlaid with iron nails along the seams. I couldn't explain the feeling I had when I first saw it. It wasn't fear, not quite. More like recognition. Like I'd seen it before in a dream or a nightmare I couldn't remember. But I convinced myself it was the allure of something ancient, something hidden. Maybe there was gold inside. Artifacts. Something valuable. I should have known better. We broke the seal. The wax peeled away with a hiss like air escaping along. The iron popped free with a dull echo that seemed to go on too long. The lid was heavier than expected, even with 4 men lifting. It slid aside with a dry, grinding sound, and I remember thinking, please be empty. But it wasn't. There was no body, no bones, no triasure, just a bundle of red-stained cloth, neatly arranged like it had been wrapped around something long gone. At the bottom, something glistened, a shallow pool of thick, wet liquid. Not blood exactly, not paint. Something in between. It clung to the stone like oil, and it smelled wrong. Not rotten, not chemical. Wrong in a way I still can't name. I reached in just to touch it. It was warm. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cold from the cellar felt like it had followed me upstairs into my temporary quarters. I kept hearing noises, shuffling, maybe rats, but heavier, like footsteps too slow to belong to anything living. Around 3 a.m., I heard a scratch, soft at first, then more insistent. It came from beneath the floorboards, directly under my bed. When I got up to look, it stopped. The next morning, one of the workers didn't show up. No one had seen him leave. His tools were still by the crypt. His gloves were sitting on the edge of the stone coffin. One of them was soaked through. Red, still wet. I told myself it was nothing. Probably a joke. A bad one. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. Something had noticed. And it wasn't finished yet. It started with one man missing. Then it became two. And within the week, 4 names were gone from the morning roll call. No messages, no resignations, just silent absences and abandoned belongings. Their tools lay untouched, as if they'd stepped away for a break and never returned. I walked the site alone early one morning, trying to keep the panic at bay. It wasn't unusual for temporary labor to flake, especially on jobs this isolated, but this didn't feel like that. Their gear hadn't been picked up. Some of it had been arranged. That's the word that stuck with me. A helmet perched atop a broom handle like a crude effigy. Gloves placed carefully at the bottom of a wheelbarrow, submerged beneath a shallow pool of water that hadn't been there the day before. One man's steel-toe boots were found balanced heel to heel atop a stack of stone tiles, laces tied in a perfect bow. No one on my crew had done it. I asked around, not accusing, just curious. The answers were always the same. They didn't know, hadn't touched it, hadn't even noticed anything odd. But I had. I started keeping my own notes. Not just on the missing men, but the things I couldn't quite explain. Cold spots began appearing in places that shouldn't have been cold. Spots where no airflow reached, no vents or exposed stone. They were just there, sudden and biting. I felt it first in the hallway leading to the crypt, then again near the stairwell that led to the old chapel. A crewman working up on the second floor said he felt a draft pass through his overalls, like someone had brushed past him. No one had. The strange thing was how quickly the rest of the team stopped talking about the disappearances. They went quiet when I brought it up, eyes shifting away, suddenly eager to return to their tasks. Even my foreman, a man I'd worked with for over a decade, had grown pale and distant. He didn't show up one morning either. His room was empty, nothing out of place, except his hard hat placed neatly on his pillow. I finally checked the security cameras. We'd installed them early in the project, mostly for insurance purposes. The system wasn't great, but it covered the key zones: entry points, tool storage, and the lower cellars. At first, the footage showed nothing unusual. The occasional glitch, some static, but that was normal with the humidity down there. Then I caught something strange. In the time-stamped recordings from 2 nights prior, just before the first worker disappeared, there was a flicker in the reflection of a water basin we'd been using for mixing grout. The camera's angle just barely caught the edge of it. For a fraction of a second, a shape passed through the frame. Robed, hooded, featureless. It didn't register in the actual room, only in the reflection. I went back through more footage. It was never direct, never visible head-on, but again and again, in windows, water, polished tile, a figure. Motionless at times, moving in others, always in the background, always watching. I didn't sleep much after that. When I did, the dreams were worse than the wakefulness. They started with silence, thick, oppressive silence like the world had been muted. Then the chanting began, low, rhythmic in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. I stood in the center of a stone chamber. No, not stood. I knelt, hand-bound. The monks surrounded me, faceless and hunched. Each one wore robes stained with something dark and glistening, and in the center of their circle was the stone coffin, now cracked down the middle. From within it pulsed a steady drip of red, like sap from a wounded tree. I would wake drenched in sweat, my ears ringing with the remnants of a language not meant to be spoken aloud. One of the newer electricians, Armand, I think his name was, refused to believe any of it. He mocked the missing, joked about curses and ghost stories, said he'd seen worse working old mines in Romania. But even he started acting strange. He stopped making eye contact, stared off at corners of rooms like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. One afternoon, we lost contact with him over the radio. I'd been in the cellar when it happened. Static buzzed in from his line, followed by the sound of his breathing, fast, irregular. Then a sudden shriek, like the radio had shorted. But it didn't cut off. It looped. Not the scream itself, but the moment of the scream. A low, wet inhale, the start of shout, the rustle of cloth, and then again. Over and over, like a stuck recording, echoing through the comms. We tore through the building looking for him, but there was nothing. His tools were still where he'd been working, his harness clipped into the support beam. But he was gone. That night, no one stayed in the building. I slept in my truck, or tried to. I kept seeing the reflection in my windshield, even with nothing in front of it. Just a shape, pulsing, swaying slightly as if suspended in water. No face, no eyes, just the hint of a hood and the stain of something red dripping steadily from the hem of its robe. By the end of the week, nearly half the team had quit. Some left quietly in the night, leaving behind full toolkits. Others sent short texts or emails, nothing detailed, just that they wouldn't be returning. I couldn't blame them, but I couldn't leave either. Something had taken root in my mind. I couldn't walk away until I understood it, until I saw it for myself. Then came the worst of it. I went down to the crypt alone that morning. The others had refused to even go near it after what happened to Armand. I descended the stone steps slowly, flashlight flickering slightly. The air was colder than usual, wet like the inside of a deep cave. At the base of the stairs, I turned the final corner into the chamber. The coffin was open. Not pried, not cracked, not broken. Open. The lid had been placed aside, leaned gently against the far wall. The red cloths inside were gone. Only a smear remained where they'd once lain. At the base of the coffin, liquid pooled again. Fresh, thicker than before. A trail of it led out of the crypt, winding like a slug's path, glistening under the flickering lights. I followed it. The trail led up through the cellar hall, past the old wine racks, and into the stairwell that connected to the old dormitories. My steps slowed as I reached the second floor. The air was dense. Each breath felt like I was inhaling something more than air. The trail ended at a door. One of the guest rooms we'd converted into temporary housing for the crew. I knew whose room it was. One of the youngest workers. He'd only been on the site 3 days. Friendly. Quiet. I hadn't even learned his name yet. The door was slightly ajar. No lights on inside. The room was empty, but the bed was wet. Sheets stained dark, soaked through. The smell was copper and something older. And on the wall above the headboard, carved deep into the plaster, was a symbol I'd seen before. One of the ones from the coffin. One of the ones that had been etched so deep, like someone wanted it remembered, or feared it would be forgotten. I left the room without touching anything. And for the first time since this job started, I felt the unmistakable certainty that something had woken up, and it had already started walking. It's strange how quickly curiosity can sour into dread. I had come to the monastery thinking I was restoring a piece of forgotten beauty, something old and noble, steeped in quiet history. But standing in that empty room, staring at the sigil carved into the wall above the soaked mattress, all that romanticism bled out of me like the red trail we had followed there. Something was wrong with this place. Not haunted in the way people joke about old buildings. This wasn't a place that remembered pain. This was a place built to contain it. By the next morning, I stopped pretending I could handle it alone. I reached out to a local contact, an archivist and historian I'd met years ago during another restoration near Grenoble. She had a reputation for digging up the kind of facts even churches like to forget. I didn't tell her everything, just enough to make her curious. She agreed to look into the monastery's origin, its occupants, any record from the church. She called me 2 days later. Her voice shook. That was the first red flag. The second came when she told me the monastery didn't officially exist. No archives listed it under any ecclesiastical territory. No mention in diocesan records. No mention at all. Until she found something in a collection of suppressed papal correspondences from the 16th century. A letter, faint and smudged, marked with an inked symbol that matched one of the carvings on the coffin. The name of the place was Monastir de l'Enfer Souterrain, the Monastery of the Underground Hell. Not an official name, a nickname passed among church officials. A warning, maybe it had been excommunicated. Not for political reasons. Not for rebellion. For heresy. The monks, she discovered, had not died from plague, as local legend claimed. They were executed by force and by fire, their bodies entombed beneath the structure, their names erased. The church had sealed the site, declared it damnatus, not damned but contaminated. Something about their practices had crossed a line that even centuries of ecclesiastical tolerance couldn't abide. The letters implied they had discovered something beneath the foundation, something unearthed by accident or summoned. Whatever it was, they began to worship it, not as a god, but as a presence, a whisper, a listener, something that heard them in the dark. That's when they stopped sending reports to the church. That's when visitors stopped returning. The last abbot of the monastery had written a single entry before he disappeared. The historian translated it for me. It grows louder in the stone. It speaks not in words, but in want. We are not its jailers. We are its meat. The symbols we'd found carved into the iron, the coffin, the walls, those weren't symbols of sanctity. They weren't protective. They were binding marks, wards of imprisonment. What I'd taken for religious reverence was a desperate attempt at containment. And the cloth inside the coffin, they weren't wrappings. They were robes, arranged as though meant to represent a body, as though something had worn them once and had left them behind. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore what was happening to me. The dreams intensified. They weren't dreams anymore. Not really. They began as shadows behind my eyelids, then opened up into full scenes that bled into waking hours. I saw the chapel not as it was now, but as it had once been, stone benches packed with silent, unmoving monks. In every dream, I was among them, no longer a visitor, but a participant. I wore the robes now, the red-stained ones. My hands were bound at first, but then I stood. I led them in chants, in a language I did not understand, yet knew deeply. My mouth moved on its own, shaping syllables I could feel in my teeth and throat, vowels that vibrated into the bone. Sometimes the dreams ended with the stone coffin opening, but not from above. From within, something pushing outward, something covered in robes like mine, but with no face. Just the suggestion of a face, just awareness, and eyes, dripping blood not from wounds, but from within. The blood came from behind the eyes, and in the dream, it came from mine too. I stopped sleeping. The last straw came when one of the workers returned. He had been missing for almost 5 days. A local search party had found him at the edge of the nearby forest, curled beneath the roots of an overturned tree, caked in mud and dried blood, shivering but alive. I visited him in the hospital. He didn't respond to his name or to any questions, but he spoke, softly, repeatedly, one phrase, over and over, in a cracked whisper, Induit carnum sanctum. The staff didn't know what it meant. I did. I asked the historian. He wears the skin of the holy. The doctors said his condition was catatonic, that his mind had likely fractured under stress, maybe from a head injury or dehydration. But I had seen the way his fingers moved under the blanket. He wasn't twitching. He was tracing symbols into the sheets. Over and over. I returned to the monastery that night, alone. I don't remember the drive. I don't remember unlocking the main doors. I just remember walking straight to the cellar, flashlight in one hand, the historian's notes in the other. The air had changed again. Heavier now. The lights we'd strung flickered in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like breathing. I followed the hallway past the stacked stones and the rusted barrels, past the piles of old bones that no longer startled me. The coffin stood exactly as we had left it, open, empty, quiet. But I looked closer this time. Inside the base, where the robes had once been folded, where the red fluid still clung to the edges. I saw them. Scratch marks. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. Deep, desperate gouges torn into the stone, radiating out from the center, as though something had clawed its way up. Not buried, not placed, trapped. I ran my hand along the edge, following the deepest of the grooves. My fingers trembled. I felt something wet. It was still fresh. And worse than that, on the inner wall of the coffin, there were smaller scratches, like fingernails, carved in tight, panic strokes. Not by claws, Not by some monstrous thing, but by human hands. Something hadn't been placed into that coffin to rest. Something had been shoved inside, and something or someone had tried to get out. And maybe, just maybe they had. The monastery stopped pretending to be a ruin. It no longer creaked and settled like old buildings do. It breathed. It shifted behind my back when I wasn't looking. It listened. The changes were subtle at first, almost dismissible. Water pressure dropping for no reason. Lights flickering in rooms that had functioning wiring the day before. But then the leak started. At first, it seemed like a burst pipe. One of the ground floor radiators hissed and spewed water tinged with something rusty. Then the kitchen sink. Then the shower in the upstairs dormitory. The water came out thick, and it didn't smell like rust. It smelled sweet, copper sweet. Familiar. One of the crew brought me a sample in a jar. I didn't need tests to know what it was. It was the same red fluid from the coffin. The same color, same viscosity. But now it wasn't just pooling at the base of a sealed tomb. It was in our plumbing. It was moving, climbing. The next leak came from a light fixture. Drip, drip, drip. Onto a table someone had just finished sanding. The finish bubbled. The table warped. I tried shutting down the site. Called the client. They laughed. Thought I was exaggerating. Renovations were expensive. Delays more so. They asked if I needed to be replaced. Elite. I said I had it under control. That night, I checked the security feeds. Out of habit, really. I had grown used to the strange glitches, the occasional frozen frames, and pixelated warps. But what I saw wasn't a glitch. There at exactly 3:07 a.m. was me, working alone in the cellar, moving from the crypt to the utility closet and back. No lights on, no tools, just me walking, carrying something in both hands. Something long, something wrapped in cloth. I knew I hadn't been awake. I checked my hands the next morning, red under the fingernails, my palms sticky, my boots coated in a faint crust of something dark. The camera footage had no audio, but in the background of that flickering grain, I swear I could see the red liquid spilling over my wrists, trailing behind me like a thread unspooling. I washed my hands 4 times. The smell wouldn't leave. I tried calling the historian again. No answer. I left voicemails, then stopped, realizing I didn't remember what I'd said in half of them. Something about symbols. Something about vows. Something about hearing the stone breathe. 2 days later, she was found. The police said she'd been hiking near the monastery, that she must have fallen. But I saw the photos. She was hanging from the old church bell tower, arms bound, ankles bloodied from rope burns, her body limp. Her mouth was sewn shut with heavy black twine, crisscrossed in a crude X, flesh pinched and swollen around the threads. Her eyes were open. No animal had done that. After the discovery, the site descended into chaos. The last remaining workers, 3 of them, turned on me. They accused me of hiding something, of lying about the dangers, of orchestrating the whole thing. One claimed to have found a bundle of robes in my room. I told them I'd never seen them before, but they didn't believe me. And maybe I didn't either. The robes matched the ones in the coffin. Coarse, red-stained linen, folded with care, laid across my bed like an offering. My hands were shaking when I picked them up, but not from fear. From familiarity. The fabric felt right, like I had worn them before. I started locking my door at night, not to keep others out, but to keep myself in. Time began to slip. I'd blink and find myself standing in the cellar. No memory of how I got there. I'd lose hours, days. Meals would spoil in front of me. Alarms would go off and I wouldn't hear them. I stopped dreaming altogether, only waking up mid-step, mid-task, red fingerprints on door handles and streaks on walls where I didn't remember touching. I started to avoid mirrors. It wasn't the fear of what I'd see. It was the knowledge that sometimes I wouldn't see myself at all. Or worse, sometimes I'd see something else entirely. Eyes that weren't mine. Not just in color, they were wrong. Too large. Too empty. Pupilless. Glossy like obsidian, rimmed in red, as if crying blood from the inside out. When I leaned in, they didn't blink. Then I'd blink, and they'd be mine again. Just tired. Bloodshot. Exhausted. There were marks on my arms, too. Not wounds. Not scratches. Symbols. Faint, but burned into the skin like brands that had faded over time. Each night they deepened. Each morning I could feel them itch. The worst was the night the whispers started speaking directly to me. Not in dreams, not in hallucinations. In the waking silence. It began beneath the floor. Low, vet, as if something with no throat was pushing air through its mouth. I followed it without thinking. Down the stairs, past the flickering lights, into the cellar. I didn't bring a flashlight. I didn't need one. The crypt was darker than usual. The coffin was humming. Not audibly, not really, but I felt it in my ribs. A vibration, like a tuning fork pressed against bone. The drain in the corner, the one we had uncovered while digging to reroute piping, was gurgling. Slowly, deliberately, like it was breathing in. I leaned down to hear it better. The voice came not from the drain, but from inside it. Hollow, echoing, and yet intimate, as though it knew me, had always known me. It didn't command. It didn't threaten. It simply informed. You were ready to take the vows. That was all. But the words weren't in English. They weren't even words, not in any human sense. I didn't hear them so much as remember them, like a story someone had told me in a different life. A promise I had made in another body. I stood there, unmoving for what felt like hours. The red fluid bubbled softly at my feet, oozing from the cracks in the stone. My fingertips itched. In the silence that followed, I understood something deeply, horribly true. I hadn't broken the seal. I had fulfilled it, and it had never been a tomb. It was a threshold. The silence became total. The crew had long since vanished. Some left willingly, most did not. The company finally pulled the plug, abandoned the site, citing cost overruns, labor disputes, environmental instability. Excuses stacked like scaffolding over the truth. They sent a car to collect me. I never got in. I remained. The contract was terminated. Payments ceased. Phone calls stopped. No one came looking. Not for the others. Not for me. The world outside seemed to forget the monastery existed, just as the church had once done. I took that as a sign. Proof I was meant to stay. My work was not done. The ritual had not ended. It had barely begun. I stopped sleeping. Not out of fear, but necessity. Dreams had become too real, too directional. I would wake up in new places, having dug through walls, arranged symbols in the dust, my fingers raw and nails packed with crumbled mortar. Sometimes I awoke in the crypt, standing motionless beside the coffin, my reflection in the oozing red liquid staring back with eyes that didn't belong to me. There were paths beneath the monastery I hadn't seen before, or maybe they hadn't wanted to be seen. The deeper I went, the more the walls began to change. Not physically, but perceptually. The stone grew damp and porous like breathing skin. The air thickened into a molasses-like heat that stuck to my chest. I found carvings along the passageways. Symbols, yes, but also names. Dozens of them. Some scratched in with shaking hands, others chiseled deeply, deliberately. Eventually, I found my own. Written in Latin with a hand older than my bloodline should allow. The spelling archaic, but unmistakably my name. Or rather, the name I had once been known by. I couldn't pronounce it, not properly, but I could feel it. A name isn't just a label. It's a frequency. And something below had remembered mine. I kept going. The subchamber was buried beneath a false floor, hidden under the crypt like a wound scabbed over. I don't remember uncovering it. One morning, I simply stood before it, already holding the tools. I peeled away stone and earth until the hatch emerged, sealed by a rusted wheel of iron and fused wax long since blackened by time. I turned it without resistance. The wax crumbled beneath my fingers like old skin. The door opened inward. The stench at first. Not rot, not mildew, something heavier. A scent that clung to memory rather than nose. Something that reeked of ancient knowledge and consequence. I descended alone. The chamber was vast, far larger than the monastery above it. The ceilings vaulted high into shadows my flashlight couldn't touch. But I didn't need to see it all. I felt it. Coffins. Hundreds of them. Each one hewn from the same pale stone. Each sealed shut with iron bands and wax. Symbols etched into their lids pulsed faintly in the dark, bleeding that same thick red substance. It oozed in slow rivulets, as if the stone itself were weeping. The air shimmered. The floor pulsed. It was not a tomb. It was a prison, and it was full. This was the truth the monks had tried to erase. Not a plague, not a curse, but a contagion of consciousness, a thought virus that moved through minds like mold through damp wood, infecting not bodies but identity. It didn't kill. It rewrote. The monks hadn't gone mad. They had become vessels, mouthpieces for something that didn't think the way we think. It didn't use language. It used presence. Once you were touched by it, yourself began to dissolve, fragment by fragment, until only the voice remained. And it sounded like you. I wasn't just possessed. I had always belonged here. That realization hit with the certainty of gravity. I was not some outsider defiling this place. I was part of it. A missing component. A piece that had been excised and returned. The carvings in the crypt, the echoes in the drain, the dreams, none of it had been intrusion. It had been recognition. I began to understand that I had sent myself here. The records, the contracts, the proposal to renovate the site. I had believed the company discovered the monastery and assigned me as lead contractor. But I found the application buried deep in my files. A proposal I had submitted. Detailed, persuasive, meticulous. Dated 6 months before the monastery was even listed for purchase. The email address was mine. I didn't remember writing it. But as I read the lines, I felt the cadence of something old behind my fingertips. The phrasing didn't match my usual speech patterns. There were archaic turns of phrase, strange choices of punctuation, a hand reaching through time to guide mine. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it made me feel whole. I stopped using the main building. I moved into the crypt, bedding beside the open coffin. The red liquid no longer burned my skin. It soothed it. I marked the walls with the sigils I now remembered. I didn't need to translate them. I understood them. Somewhere above, time continued. Seasons passed. Snow fell, then melted. But here, beneath the stone, nothing aged. The red fluid never dried. The breath in the walls never ceased. I began hearing them again. Footsteps above, whispering in the chapel, bells that hadn't rung in centuries tolling softly in my skull. The monks were never truly gone. They had not died. They had become. Their minds now slumbered beneath those stone lids, waiting for others like them to return. For others like me. I write this now not as a warning, but as a confession. They sealed it to keep it in. I broke it thinking I was freeing a secret. But the secret was me. The crypt doesn't close because I was never supposed to leave.